And as Susan said, it's all about building that value within your practice, building that premium so that it's really, really attractive when you're ready to sell. So before we get into the topic, I'm just going to introduce myself. I head up the valuations team here at Schein Dental Practice Sales. And I've been working in healthcare acquisitions for over 20 years, both for a mix of independent and corporate companies. And my job is to travel around the country to meet with principal dentists and to firstly value their practices, and then really to assist them through that journey planning, whether it be growing their value or just maintaining that value up until the time in which they're ready to sell. And I also oversee, we have a valuation panel that we meet as valuers every week to value practices from all over the country. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at today. What's valuable about your dental practice, and potentially what you feel is valuable might be very different to what a buyer thinks is valuable, what the bank thinks is valuable, and what I think as a valuer. So we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about the key metrics of your practice performance. Do you know what they are? Do you know how well you compare to other practices? And then we're going to look at what it is that's inside your scope of control and essentially build an action plan for you in terms of building value. And finally, we'll look at sustainable profit and how that really helps drive that premium price that we are looking to talk about. So why is value more important than ever? Well, I believe that the modern dentist career has changed a lot, particularly since the time that I started valuing. There's been a real shift. Historically, it was all about retirement sales. It was dentists in their late 50s or their early 60s who maybe had owned the practices for 20, 30 years, looking to sell to retire. But we know that dentists want a bit more from their careers these days. And so it's about this loop: qualifying, learning your trade, and then if you're ambitious enough, purchasing a practice. And dentists are becoming a lot more business savvy. So it's really about growing and building a successful business, not just providing a healthcare service anymore. But we know that running a business can be really, really tough, whether that's HR issues, whether it's recruitment issues, whether it's CQC compliance. And we're finding that people are running their businesses for a number of years, maybe a decade, 15 years, but then they are looking to sell much earlier in that journey, maybe in their mid-40s, and return to what they really love doing, which is the clinical work, maybe some education, some training, some different things along their career before retiring. And because of this change, actually that value is more important than ever, because you're building up an asset, you're building up a successful business, and you want to sell that asset for the highest possible price, because essentially the proceeds of that sale might have to last you for much longer if you are selling much earlier on in your career. So what does value look like to you? As I go out and meet dentists, I hear lots of things that people are proud of about their practices. And they'll often talk to me about their patients. Look at these cards on the wall. Look at these thank you cards. This is what our patients say about us. We see 3 generations of the same family. So that's a real measure of success and value. And we know in this day and age, patients want everything at their doorstep. They want convenience, they want choice. And if they're happy about it, they might leave you a nice review. And if they're unhappy about it, they'll probably leave you something a bit more negative online. So it's that kind of communication around patients. A long-serving team is always valuable, A, because it helps you maintain your turnover, B, because it helps provide that service that those patients are seeking, and C, because essentially it helps with your sanity if you're not having to replace team members all the time. So I can understand why having sort of a legacy team is really important. Potential for growth. Another thing that I hear all the time is, well, the practice doesn't have a website, the practice doesn't do implants, the practice doesn't market, and so a buyer will get all this potential and they can pay me for this potential. But the reality is that you will not get paid for that potential as a business owner unless you actually realize that potential. So it's up to you to grow that business, to make it succeed, to expand that value. Clinical excellence, that can be a really key thing for people, particularly if they've maybe worked for corporates and things haven't been done in the same way that they'd like them to be running their own business. And so that can be a real sort of selling point for a business. And finally, how the business looks, how the business feels is really, really important. So I'm sure some of those will resonate with you as practice owners in terms of things that you're proud about with your practices. But what does value look like to buyers? Well, in reality, it's actually a lot of the same things, but it's categorized in a slightly different way. So when a buyer buys a practice, they're interested in the goodwill of the practice. Now, the goodwill is an intangible asset. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but it's really that measure of patient loyalty. Do the patients keep coming back? Is the turnover stable? Is the turnover growing? Excuse me. And all those things that we've just talked about on the last slide, clinical excellence, the team, the reviews, how the practice feels, all of those things feed into the goodwill piece. However, goodwill on its own is not enough. So it really has to be translated into profitability. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by having a stable turnover, but by running it with an efficient clinical team, by making sure that your staffing ratios are correct, by keeping a close eye on your costs. Some of them you can't control, minimum wage, E&I costs rise, but there's other costs within the business that certainly you can keep an eye on. And it's all about that strategy when you're making decisions. So actually, do I need to take on this new clinician? Do I need to take on this new member of staff? Will that piece of equipment return the investment that I'm going to spend in it? So it's about turning turnover into good, solid profit. And then buyers really want potential. So I don't want to contradict myself, because I've just said on the last slide that actually it's important for you as a business owner to realise that potential. But also there has to be room for further growth if somebody is going to buy a practice, and certainly pay a premium price for it. So from a buyer perspective, they will wonder, is there growth? Is there revenue growth? What is not being delivered currently in the practice that can be explored? And is there the chair availability to do that? And if there's not, can the opening hours be increased? Can we add another surgery? Can the business even be physically expanded with a building works expansion? So it's these three things: goodwill, profit, and potential. And they all feed into sustainable profit. So yes, there might be profit within your accounts, but actually, will that profit still be there if a new owner takes over your business? And will that profit be there for a number of years to come? So essentially, that is what makes the most valuable businesses, having a profitable operation that is potentially sustainable for years to come. So how do we deliver that sustainable profitability? So I'm sure if I asked you as a business owner, do you know what your business turns over? Do you know what your annual turnover is? You could probably tell me £250,000, £500,000, £1 million, whatever it is. But if I asked you, do you know what percentage of that turnover you spend on certain key costs, like clinical costs, staff costs? You probably wouldn't know. So we're going to demonstrate this visually to make it a bit more digestible. So this rectangle we have here represents our annual turnover of a dental practice. And it can be anything. It can be £500,000, it could be £5 million, but essentially that rectangle is the annual turnover. And what my job as a valuer is to do is to actually apportion all of that turnover into key cost areas. So suddenly we split up our rectangle into lots of different areas. And this particular example is for an owner-run dental practice. So imagine we have a principal, we have a nearly full-time associate, we have an ad hoc specialist that comes once a month, and we have a hygienist at the practice. So this is reasonably what the practice can expect to spend on different cost areas. Excuse me. So if we start with our clinical costs, so of the 100% turnover, we can expect to spend around about 19% on our clinicians, so our dentists, associates, therapists, hygienists. If we then look at our lab and materials, another approximately 14% of spend of turnover will be attributed to lab and material costs. And again, it depends what type of practice you're running. If you are doing a lot of aligner treatments, if you're doing a lot of implants, then that might reasonably be higher. We then have our staff costs, our support team, nurses, receptionists, practice manager, and they will usually cost the business around about 20% of turnover. Our overheads, they're the other costs that we have within the practice, that we have to have them, and they change a little bit, but they don't change significantly with the amount of turnover you deliver. So that's things like IT costs, insurance, marketing and advertising, subscriptions, postage, utilities, telephone, all those other ancillary costs. Our rental typically will cost around 1 to 2% of our turnover, so that's a very low cost. But essentially, if this practice is being run in the way it should be run, then we end up with about 40% profit. So what that means is for every pound of dentistry, about 40 pence would be profit. So exactly the same example. Again, we're looking at our turnover of our practice, but this time we're going to look at if it's an associate-led practice, just in case anyone is running an associate-led practice that's joined on the call tonight. So this one looks a bit different. In this instance, our biggest rectangle is our cost for clinicians. And that's because in an associate-run dental practice, every pound of dentistry has a corresponding associate cost against it. So instead of making 40% profit, 40% of the turnover instantly disappears on the clinicians. Some of the other costs, staff costs, lab and materials, rent are fairly stable. They're similar to an owner-run practice. But what we do see here is our overheads, those more fixed running costs, they tend to be a bit smaller because associate-run dental practices tend to be a bit larger, and the more turnover you have, the less of a burden on turnover your business insurance is, the less of a burden your telephone bill becomes. So that gets smaller and smaller as the turnover grows. And crucially, for an associate-led practice, that practice typically should be making about 20% profit. So 20 pence in the pound of turnover should be profit. And that is essentially what we would consider to be a sustainable level of profit. So let's translate that into numbers, because actually graphs are all very well, but sometimes you can't actually visualize that in terms of what it means for your business. So if we have an owner-run business that turns over £1 million, they're spending 19% of their turnover on clinical costs. That's about £190,000, 14% of turnover on lab and materials, 20% on staff, 1% on rent, and about 8% on overheads. So your average owner-run business will make around about £380,000 profit for every £1 million of turnover. So by contrast, for our associate model, our turnover is much higher in this regard, because actually associate-run practices tend to be bigger operations. So we're going to start with a turnover of £2 million, but this time we're spending 40% on clinical costs. So you can see there the difference in terms of that spend. 14% on lab and materials again, 20% on staff, 1% on rent, and our overheads are a little bit lower because we have a much bigger turnover to absorb those sorts of costs. So for this particular example, our profit of our business is around £400,000 for £2 million of turnover, so 20%. And what that tells us is actually an associate-run business probably needs to be turning over almost double to make the same amount of profit that an owner-run business is going to make. Okay. So why is profit important? Well, it's easy to assume that you have a business with a turnover that continues to grow, and it's easy to assume that that translates into value growth. So yes, my business value is growing each year because my turnover is growing. But actually, profit is the most important thing when we value a business, not turnover, but profit. There's lots of things, as you can see there, that are important. Turnover is one of them, but actually valuations center around profitability. And when we value, we multiply profit by a particular multiplier, typically up to about 4 times profit for an owner sale, and typically up to 7 to 8 times profit for a group or corporate sale. And so what that means is if your business is £10,000 more profitable than the average business, when we multiply that, your business could be making £70,000, £80,000 more profit than a practice down the road, for example. But also, if we look at it on the flip side, if your business is £10,000 less profitable than a comparable business, you could be losing £70,000 to £80,000 of business, of value when you come to sell your business. And so that's why that graph that I've showed you and understanding those numbers and how they relate to your business is crucial, particularly if you are looking to drive value and to really get buyers to pay a premium. So I guess one of the calls to action from today's webinar is, do you know your numbers? Particularly if you're looking at selling over the next 5 to 10 years, it's a really, really important exercise to understand your business, understand where you are currently, and then make a plan accordingly. So why is it important to know your numbers? Aligning expectation with reality is really important, and we're going to move on to that in the next slide, in the next few slides, as to what happens if your expectations don't meet reality. But I think it's very easy to assume, oh, I've got a 3-surgery practice, it's a mixed practice, I have a friend down the road that sold for £1 million, therefore my business will sell for £1 million. But actually, because we value using profit, no two businesses value the same, even if on paper you feel that they are very comparable. So firstly, get your expectations right in terms of what your particular business is worth. And secondly, by doing this early in your planning, in your exit strategy, you've got the time to rectify it. If the expectation doesn't meet reality, if it's not in the right place, there's the time to implement an action plan and to watch that grow. So, controlling the controllables. Firstly, we talk about things that are inside of our control when we're trying to develop a premium business. Your expectations are certainly within your control. The profit of your business is within your control. And I know some business owners might feel that in recent years it's been very hard to control profit. And I completely agree with that. But as an overall business, there are things you can control, which then feed down to the bottom line. The look and feel of your practice is certainly within the scope of your control. And finally, the timing. When is the right time to sell your practice? That is also within your control. So we're going to take each of these points in the next 4 to 5 slides and use it as a bit of an action plan for your business. But before we do that, let's just touch on the things that you can't control, because I think it's good to be aware of them, even if they are outside of your control. So interest rates, of course, have fluctuated significantly over the last couple of years, and it has had an impact on the market. It has changed the value of dental practices. Luckily, they're coming down, and that's having a positive impact. But whatever is going on in the wider economy, you can't control that. Buyer demand. There's buyers that come into the market and then go out of the market, and the multipliers they will use, the measure of profit that they will use to buy a practice will change as well. And again, that's determined by the economy, by supply and demand, so it's outside of your control. We know it's been really tough in terms of the dental recruitment market over the last couple of years, and that has had an impact on valuations and saleability of practices. But again, outside of your control. And finally, there's a lot of talk around the potential reform to the NHS. If you own an NHS business, that will potentially have an impact on your valuation. But again, if you get these things right, then you can minimize the impact of the things you can't control. So it's all about understanding what you can control and then taking action, and that will minimize any negative action as well. So step 1, controlling your expectations. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 practices that I valued 7 days apart. And when I went out to see both principal dentists, they were both ready to sell their businesses. So valuation 1, it was a private practice. It was based in the home counties. And this was a big, big practice. It had 8 surgeries in the building, a lovely practice, really modern. And only 3 of those surgeries were actually being utilised. So as you can imagine, turnover was lower than expected for an 8-surgery practice, but probably in line with a 3-surgery practice. Now, the particular principal dentist, when I spoke to him before I valued, he was looking to achieve about 1.2 million pounds for his practice. In reality, when we valued, the valuation came in at £700,000. Why was that? Because 20% of his turnover was being spent on this big, beautiful building that potentially he wasn't actually filling. So if I just take you back to picture that graph with the rectangles, the rent and rate sort of portion of that should have been about 1% of the big rectangle. If you suddenly make that 20%, if that rectangle grows, then the one that shrinks is the profitability. So no other areas in the rectangle change size. Your clinical costs, your lab and material costs, they all stay the same, but actually what shrinks is your profitability. And so that had a real impact on valuation. In the second example, again, a private practice, again in the home counties, this was a much smaller practice, so it only had 2 surgeries, but turning over about 400k. And that particular client, they had no idea what their business was worth. So when we valued it at nearly £1 million, as you can imagine, they were pretty happy. But why was it valuing so well? Because all of those costs, all of those key cost areas were below the benchmark levels. So if you think of all those other rectangles, clinical costs, lab and materials, staff costs, but they're all being smaller than in a typical practice. And the impact is that your profit rectangle just grows and grows. And because we're multiplying that for valuation, as I've said, that has a real deliverable impact on value. So the outcome was that the first practice was not in a position to sell. Even though they were ready to sell, they have gone away and they're working on their business and trying to get it into a better, more valuable state for a sale. The second practice has come to market and is going ahead with the process as we speak. And this is sometimes why we call valuations that light bulb moment. As a valuer, we look at your business in a very different way to how you look at it, even how your accountant looks at it. And sometimes it just gives you that piece of information you didn't know that allows you to kind of manage your expectations and align them with reality. So the best thing you can do is have a valuation. That's essentially how to control your expectations. Speak to a valuer, understand the current valuation of your business, but not just the top line number. The top line number is important, but also where your business sits in each of those key cost areas. So step 2, controlling profit. So let's say you've had a valuation and the profit isn't where you want it to be, the value isn't where you want it to be. The first step is to identify which cost area is pulling the valuation down. Is it the staff costs? Is it the lab and material costs? Is it the overheads? Is it the clinical costs? And once we've identified the cost area, we can drill down into the cause of that. So if it's the staff costs, is it because, for instance, we have an employed hygienist who is being paid her salary every month, but potentially there's lots of fails to attend. And so that chair is sat empty for a big proportion of the week. There's not enough income being generated to cover the cost of that annual salary. So identify the cost area, drill down into the cause, and then we can ask ourselves, is it in my control? And if it is, then absolutely brilliant. We can put together an action plan to address that issue. It's that old saying, knowledge is power, and it's absolutely true. If you understand where your business sits in terms of benchmarks, and if it happens to sit above, if it's running less efficiently than it could be, that knowledge will give you the power to make changes and to drive that value. Just going back to the is it in my control thing, it's a really interesting discussion area. We often see practices in, for instance, Harley Street that have really, really high rentals. And if you have a high rental for your practice, that isn't in your control unless you're going to relocate, which is unlikely. It's about accepting that actually for me, my practice rent takes up 5% of that turnover instead of 1% of that turnover. So then you have 2 options in that case. The first option is that you might not be able to control rental costs, but maybe there are other costs within the business that you can control to improve profit. So what is in my control that I can do, even though that is outside of my control? And the second thing is, if there really isn't anything you can do, it's about the expectation piece again. As long as you manage your expectations in terms of your value, then ultimately you should be happy with the sale price. So knowledge is power. What are the factors that commonly reduce profit below expected levels? So when we as a valuation panel meet every week, there are times where practices don't value particularly well. And the three most common reasons for that are overstaffing, secondly, inefficient use of clinicians, and thirdly, costly overheads. So we're going to look at a couple of these in more detail now. So if we start with the overspend on practice one. So a practice I went to see a couple of years ago now, they were overspending significantly on their staffing costs. And when I say significantly, I take you back to this diagram here. So this particular practice was spending 40% of their turnover on staffing costs. So if you remember, that should be 20%, and this one should be 40%. But because they were spending 40% on staff costs, the impact was that profit was really, really being squeezed. Why was that happening? What was the root cause of that? Well, this particular practice had 1.9 nursing hours to every clinical hour. 1.9, so almost double, almost 2 nurses for every clinician. And when I spoke to them, they said to me, well, we know we're a bit overstaffed. It was something they were quite aware of. But what they weren't aware of was the impact that that would have on valuation. And actually that lost them £415,000 in terms of value. And that's a huge amount, particularly if you are planning this as your funding for retirement, your pot to last you. Nobody wants to let go of £400,000 of lost value. And so it's about understanding why that's happening, and then taking action. And that action doesn't have to be drastic. It doesn't have to be making people redundant. It can just be gradually taking steps to reduce the nursing hours as that opportunity arises. So if a member of the team is leaving, do we really need to replace that member at all? If we do, can we do it on reduced hours? Maybe it's even going out to the staff and just saying, look, we're having a rejig of surgery hours. Would anybody like to cut back their hours? And actually, there are ways and means of doing that. And once you are aware of the impact of that overstaffing, you can make that strategic decision making. So in the second example, this practice was overspending on overheads. So the area in concern was actually marketing spend. So over the last couple of years, we've seen a trend in that practices want to spend on marketing, and that makes sense, particularly those practices that are maybe targeting not just general dentistry, but aligner growth, implant growth, cosmetic dentistry. They are spending a lot in terms of marketing spend, and that's okay if it's driving turnover growth. But this particular practice, they were spending £75,000 a year on marketing spend, and actually their turnover was growing even less than I would expect a typical practice that was spending nothing on marketing spend. So again, we can see here, this overhead column, which should be somewhere between 5 to 8%, has grown, and the resultant impact is that the profit has got smaller. And so £263,000 of lost value in this case. And again, not quite as drastic as the first example, but still really, really important. If you are growing a business and you're putting sort of blood, sweat and tears into a business over a number of years, you want to get every pound of value out at the end. So the action was to assess the return on investment. So if this marketing spend is not paying you back, if it's not increasing your turnover, look at reducing that spend. What else could that money be spent on? Does that money even need to be spent? And so again, it's just this strategic decision making. So for step 3, selling sunset. So this is all about controlling the look and feel of your practice. I think it's fairly typical for principal dentists, as they get towards a sale, they don't necessarily want to invest in their premises. And that's quite common because they feel this is not going to pay back. I'm going to spend this money and I'm not going to get it back, essentially. And there's a couple of things to be said there. Firstly, there are tax advantages to upgrading in equipment, and that's certainly something your accountant can advise you on. And secondly, when we value, we strip out those sorts of one-off costs. So if a new chair has been popped into a surgery, then we remove that when we're looking at the ongoing profitability of the business, because that cost isn't going to come into the business every year. So we remove that cost anyway. It won't make your business less valuable if you invest in equipment. What is more likely is actually that equipment might help you grow that business. So if you're thinking about buying a CBCT because it will drive implant growth, then by all means go ahead with that. If you are thinking about adding a surgery because essentially you can grow turnover, that will have that impact as well. It's also important to remember that buying a practice for a buyer is very much like buying a house. So we've all been to view houses before, and we've taken one step in the door and thought, no, you get that instant gut reaction. And it's the same with a dental practice. If your practice doesn't feel nice, if it feels very dated or run down, the buyer is going to feel that too, and they're less likely to want to make an offer. So do sort of invest in your practice, do invest in digital technology, in AI, because actually this is where the future of dentistry lies, and this is what buyers are looking for as well. Step 4, controlling your timing. You're only going to sell your business once, and so it's really, really important that you do it right first time. And you probably don't think of your business as an asset, but that's essentially what it is. You want to get the most money possible from that asset. So careful planning of your exit strategy is key. We tend to work with principal dentists for 5 to 10 years to help them along that journey and make sure they're making the right decision at the right time. And really it's a balance between maximizing price. Of course, when I speak to principal dentists, they want to grow and grow, and they say, oh, we'll just wait till then because we're uplifting our plan prices, or we'll just wait till next year because we're adding a surgery. And that growth is amazing. You want to get as much as possible from your valuation. However, it's really, really important, as we've already spoken about, that there is still somewhere for a buyer to take the business. Nobody will pay a premium for your practice if you've already maxed it out. And so selling at the right time before you've reached that ceiling is important. It also depends on the type of buyer you're seeking. So our practices with a turnover of up to about 750k tend to sell to an independent dentist. They tend to value up to around 1.4, 1.5 million. And independent dentists are still very active and they want to buy practices, but they need to go to the bank for funding. And the bank will lend in the sector, but essentially once your business gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you're probably pricing an independent dentist out of the market. If you want to sell to a corporate, then you have to think about your tie-in period. So corporates are active, but they will essentially want you to stay on in the business for 3 to 5 years post-sale. And so that can have a real impact about the right time to start that sale process. You want to sell early enough that by the time that tie-in period is finished, you are ready to leave the practice. You're not desperate to leave the practice and you're still tied in for years to come. So they're the things that are really in our control. And although market dynamics is not in our control, it's something I just want to touch on before the end of the webinar today, because I think it's really important, particularly if you are thinking of selling your business over the next few years. So goodwill values are currently around about 124% of turnover. So if you turn over £1 million, then value can be in the range of about 1.24. Now, we value on profit. I've already said that throughout the presentation. We don't value on turnover, but this is a goodwill survey, so it looks at all the deals that happened over the last 12 months, and it tells you the averages. So that's kind of where the market is at. It has been a little bit depressed because of the interest rates, but in 2025 it really picked up and it's continuing to accelerate even further, and this is going to rise higher as well. Crucially, independent dentists are still looking to purchase, so that's really, really positive. There's this misconception that it's all about corporates, but actually 60% of practices are still independently owned, and the banks are very keen to lend to independent dentists. Corporates and groups are out there. They are wanting the best practices and they will pay a premium, but for them it's all about sustainability of the business. So that tie-in making you stay on post sale after you've sold your business helps with that sustainability, that sustainable profit. And particularly if the practice has an NHS contract, a corporate or a group will need to know that that is deliverable. Those targets can be met year on year. And as I've talked about, it's really about the potential for growth as well. So just to sort of recap on where we've been throughout the presentation today, we've talked about what is valuable. It's all about sustainable profit, but not just the sustainable profit that's in your accounts, but from a valuation point of view, how your business compares on those key benchmark areas, that key rectangle graph that we looked at. Once we know the value of your business, we align your expectations, then we can take action accordingly. So team up with a valuer. It's really, really important to understand A, your headline figure, what your business is worth now, and B, how you compare to comparable practices, how your business benchmarks, so that we can identify if there are areas of inefficiency, areas of overspend that need to be addressed. Know your numbers, understand what that means for you as a business, not what the practice down the road sold for, but know what your business looks like currently. And then once you've had a valuation, aligned your expectations, we can really create this plan. And it might be that the plan is to grow, and there's ways in which we can do that. It might be the plan is to cut back in terms of costs. It might be the plan is to invest in equipment or your premises, or it might just be a plan for this is the right time to sell. Let's keep building for a year and then let's go to market then when the practice is the right size and it will suit the right type of buyer. And remember, the market is dynamic, so it is changing. What's valuable doesn't stay still. And actually, by having that relationship and that conversation with a valuer, they can help ensure your business stays relevant, your business still continues to attract a premium, even in maybe a slightly trickier marketplace or a changed marketplace. So in a moment, I am going to take some questions from you. Before that, I just want to say thank you for your attention. It's really, really important that actually, if you are planning a sale over the next 5 to 10 years, now is the time to be building that value, to be growing and to be ensuring that a premium price can be paid. So that all starts with a practice valuation. Our practice valuations are free, they're no obligation, they're confidential. So I usually go out and meet principal dentists in the evening when the practice is closed, because we appreciate it's quite a sensitive topic to be discussing when other people are around. So essentially, there's a couple of links there. I'll put the screen back up after we've had some questions, but if you want to book a dental practice valuation, you can scan the QR code there. And we've also got a practice sale readiness checklist, which talks about some of the things we've covered today. And it's all about, as I've said, just being prepared, understanding where your business is currently, being prepared, and then being able to take action, but crucially, having the right time scale to do that. So thank you very much for your attention. Is there anybody that would like to ask any questions at this stage?
Thank you, Alison. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat, or you can open your microphone as well. No questions.
If there is anybody that wants to ask a question but doesn't feel comfortable maybe asking it today in front of the group, then you can always email me as well separately or give me a call. We'd be happy to address any questions that way as well.
That's good. We're going to share Alison's details as well, so you can be in touch. All right. Well, I think that's going to be all for tonight. Thank you, Alison, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your time as well. And have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.